Thank you, Anusha, for this opportunity to share some research. A little bit of my lab, but also some of you may know I'm part of, as you mentioned, this company, Neuromod Devices, based in Dublin. And I thought today it would be great to just step back a little bit. A lot of times I've presented data, animal data and human data, but I wanted to spend a little more time in this more sciencey, session to talk a little bit about kind of the concept of bimodal neuromodulation and why it potentially could work in some proposed mechanism of how it may be working, right? So I thought that'd be more fun today, and then show some data. I do have to give disclaimers. I am, as already mentioned, part of Neuromod Devices, and I receive compensation from and hold equity in this company. Also part of another company, Second Wave Systems, developing ultrasound neuromodulation technologies for different conditions. And I won't be talking about that today. And I will present clinical trial data that's been sponsored by Neuromod Devices, and of course, some real world data that I wasn't part of, but coming out of Hanover Medical School. So brief background, very brief, because everyone here is quite knowledgeable on tinnitus. But we know tinnitus is a major health issue. The numbers can vary, but roughly 10 to 15% of the population struggle with tinnitus. It is a hidden condition, so there are some challenges there in building awareness of it in the general public, and also pushing more treatment options and funding for it and research. I just want to highlight two things. How do we treat tinnitus? I want to highlight two approaches. There are multiple, as many of you know. One is sound approaches, and I feel that the advantage of sound approaches, such as maskers, music therapy, and hearing aids, is that it can be implemented quite conveniently and readily and taken home to use. Although it's not solely recommended in tinnitus, in clinical guidelines. A lot of that is just, doesn't mean it doesn't work. It's just that there has to be proper clinical trials to support it in that way. But we know it can help, different tinnitus patients and can be useful. So should still be tried out for certain individuals. But the key thing there is that the tinnitus improvement can be short-term effective, but can be short-term or transient. Now, on the other end, you have psychological behavioral approaches, education counseling, I would say, falls under that, mindful-based approaches. The more well-known is cognitive behavioral therapy, and also tinnitus retraining therapy. And there were nice studies performed, impressive studies performed. And one example is this one by Sima et al. That showed that over several months, typically anywhere from 8 months to a year, you could see significant improvements in the tinnitus based on different questionnaires or measures such as the tinnitus handicap inventory. Now, the key thing here is that unlike the auditory approaches, the acoustic sound approaches, generally speaking, you could potentially get longer lasting effects. But of course, it's not as convenient as the sound approach. So then this brings us to the concept of rationale, a rational concept of bimodal neuromodulation. And just to put kind of the umbrella, the overarching goal is that, it'd be nice if you could somehow get the best of both worlds there. You could get something that is like a convenient take-home device and easy, readily to use. That could be fast acting like you get with sound approaches. But at the same time, you can have long-lasting effects like you see with CBT, for example, in being able to tackle the symptom severities, or even particularly reducing tinnitus awareness or reaction. That's what we're most interested and focused on, or my group and the company. So to understand that, this is a very crude, simplified schematic of how tinnitus is happening. Of course, this is just kind of larger proportion, but not all that may be experienced it this way. You basically have sound coming into the auditory system, up through the brainstem, midbrain, thalamus, and cortex, and the perception happens. But in many individuals, you have some form of hearing loss. And due to that hearing loss, your brain, as it does very well many times, it tries to compensate for that loss of input. But unfortunately, in some individuals, there's an increased gain increase or change in the brain that then leads to this tinnitus awareness. Now, our approach in my lab and also in the company is to not only present sound, as you saw before, but to add in a reinforcer. And in this case, it's body stimulation, and more particularly trigeminal or electrical tongue stimulation, and serve it as a reinforcer to actually make the sound effects last longer or become stronger. So that's the basic idea, to then be able to reduce the tinnitus or tinnitus awareness. And when you think about this concept, the first thing you have to have evidence for is that there's actually a neural substrate for this, that there's actually connections that would enable the sound in the body to be able to interact, to be able to enable this reinforcement, to then enable the tinnitus treatment or reduction of this awareness. And so there is strong evidence, over 30, 40 years of it, showing that, as you see on the left side, you have the sound going up, through the auditory pathway to get perception. But there's been many studies long before my time demonstrating that there's all these different body regions that project to, some direct, some polysynaptic, even as Sarah presented, these different connections at the brainstem level, but you'll have these interactions, right? So we know that the neural substrate exists, and I won't have time to get into it. If you're interested, we published in 2015 in guinea pigs, but you can basically see that different body regions can cause changes in the auditory system. And in our study, electrical stimulation of the ear with sound or electrical stimulation of the tongue of sound showed a quite high promise. And so I've been interested in those two regions. Today, I'll just focus on tongue stimulation later in the slide. Now, yes, you have the neural substrates, but the question is, can you actually shift things in the brain with that neural substrate? And again, there's, before my time too, this is a review that was done by Dr. Weinberger, who late, Weinberger at UC Irvine, 2004. So you can already see before then, he was doing an extensive review on what had already come 20 years before. So this is, if you think about 40 years of physiological evidence that you could actually shift things in the brain. And I love his work, and this plot is a prime example. So let me guide you through it. What his team at lab has been doing is they pair sounds together. So for example, pairing a tone with body stimulation together. And so what you see here, this is a plot of a single neuron, being recorded in the auditory cortex of guinea pigs. And you play a tone. For example, you could play here 0.2 kilohertz or 200 hertz. And the green line shows you that this neuron doesn't really fire much. Y-axis is, neural firing response, however they're measuring that. And you can see it doesn't really care about 0.2 kilohertz or 200 hertz. When you start increasing the frequency and you get to about 800 hertz to 1 kilohertz, you see this neuron loves this sound. It loves that frequency. And then as you go to higher and higher frequencies, presenting it to the ear, the guinea pig, the neuron doesn't care so much. And, by the time you get to 10 kilohertz, 20 kilohertz, it doesn't respond much. And we know this happens, right? I mean, neurons in the auditory pathway, they're frequency organized or tonotopically organized. And so we say this neuron is tuned to about 1 kilohertz. Now, what was quite impressive is then what you can do is present electrical stimulation of the leg or the body and pair it with, in this case, 2.5 kilohertz tone over and over again. In this case, it only required 30 trials. And then what you see is that you're able to make this neuron more sensitive to 2.5 kilohertz. And you can see here that the firing rate, at the lower frequencies, there is some kind of elevated overall activity, which is interesting, right? Spontaneous spontaneous and also driven activity. But the key thing here is that basically when you get to 2.5 kilohertz, it's more sensitive to that now. And even what's interesting is that at the previous 800 hertz or 1 kilohertz, the activity went down. And so it looks like you basically can show you can shift a neuron's sensitivity to different frequency, but also you have some form of homeostasis there. And the other thing that I thought was an interesting study is bimodal stimulation. It doesn't have to be just body stimulation, but you can actually have using vagus nerve stimulation. And some of you may have already seen this study. It was published in Nature, quite impressive study in rats, where they electrically stimulate the vagus nerve implanted in rats in the auditory cortex. And in this case, they were also showing percentage of sites, in this case, the number of neurons that are sensitive to each different frequency. And you could see here in control animals, they're 10 to 20% distribution of these neurons. And you could see that they're, not more or less evenly distributed across these different frequencies. But when they paired VNS with 9 kilohertz, and this was done with 6,000 trials, 300 times per day over 20 days, you could see that there were many more neurons or sites of neurons that were coding for this 9 kilohertz. And it wasn't just 9, you could do it with different frequencies. And in this case, they did 19 kilohertz, pairing, and you were able to get the shift to 19 kilohertz. Now I have to apologize. I had one slide here of Pavlovian. The whole title is Pavlovian. I realized it wasn't included in here. But stepping back a little bit, I did want to say the reason why I titled it Pavlovian conditioning is because over a century ago, as many of you know, there was the Pavlov's dog, and what they did there was they're able to bring food to the dog, and of course, when the dog was hungry, the dog would salivate and have that food. But what they would do then is, in that classic study, they said that they rang a bell. Actually, it wasn't just a bell. That was the least thing they did. They did other sensory inputs like light and different sounds, but even the staircase sound of the person bringing the food, that could also make the dog more sensitive to those sounds. And so when you didn't present the food, then you could actually cause the dog to salivate with that sound. And this was done over a century ago. Now, they didn't know about the brain coding properties of those effects, but it showed that you could actually cause the brain to become more sensitive to a sound that was irrelevant. And you could even imagine that if you did that over and over again, there would be a memory trace in the brain that could actually make the brain much more sensitive, but also maybe even hearing that sound in their brain. And I think of it to like when I hear music that's very pleasurable or enjoyable, even after maybe a concert or I stop listening to the music, I kind of even think that I'm hearing that music in my brain. So it's not just that you cause your brain to become more sensitive, but even kind of causing some memory traces in the brain of that sound. And what I showed you here with the physiological evidence is that there is a neural substrate and there's the ability with paired stimulation to make these increased sensitivity of those features actually happen in the brain. And so that's where, I started with the Pavlov's dog title, but now to give you confidence that there is neural substrates and physiological evidence to make that happen. So just to give you a cartoon to put it all together before I jump into the data, is that the way you could think of this then, this is a proposed mechanism, is that if you have, your brain here, it's very abstract, so, kind of simplified. You have sound perception in these cells in the brain. And I'm not saying this is just auditory cortex. I'm saying just in general, wherever the awareness happens for sound perception. And on the right side, you have the case where it's sound perception with some tinnitus. And so, of course, you've got a few neurons, which I, show here as triangles that are overcoding somehow, and there's a percept happening. And this, of course, again, is in some awareness, auditory awareness neurons. I'm not saying it's particular to auditory cortex or the inferior colliculus. So what you could do is you could do sound approaches. And in the sound approaches, you could present a tone or a higher frequency tone. And what would happen is that you get cells that are activated. And of course, then you've got your triangles, the tinnitus cells are still there. And probably what happens is you have some kind of masking effect. But then once you turn those sounds off, then your tinnitus is still there. Now, I would actually argue if you did the sound over and over again enough, you could probably have some residual effects of that activity. But for simplicity here, I'm just showing kind of you do it for a short period of time and your tinnitus is still there once the sound turns off. Now, if you believe the previous slides that I showed with this pairing effect, then the idea would be you'd present a sound and then you could actually present electrical stimulation, in this case with the tongue. And you see then the electrical symbol here plus the activity of the sound, you'd be able to pair it together. And based on the data I showed you, you would start to make cells become more sensitive to the sound you're presenting to. And also you could create memory traces of the person being able to even maybe perceive that sound, kind of a residual effect in the brain, ever so slightly though. And so what you end up getting here, as you could see, there is a increased kind of activity for those cells that you paired it with, but also some kind of homeostasis effect that I showed you before, where you get kind of a rebalance of the activity. And so it would dampen because not everything can be hyperactive. Otherwise, that could potentially lead to seizures and so forth. There's kind of a balancing mechanism in your brain. Then you'd see that the tinnitus cells could be dampened, whereas the cells that you're activating with sound could be enhanced. And so you could do this again with another sound feature, doing tongue stimulation, and you basically then activate other cells to become more sensitive to this other sound. And it would further then cause dampening of the tinnitus cells because of homeostasis. And you could imagine doing this many more times with many different sounds, right? Now, ideally, if you want to avoid the tinnitus, that would be a hypothesis, you want to avoid the tinnitus sound, but it's difficult to really know those tinnitus cells. So the idea, other ways to do many diverse sounds. And if you do that enough, then the idea is that you would be able to fully dampen that tinnitus awareness effect cells and kind of create a normalization. Now, there might be some elevated activity overall, but ever so slightly is what we would expect. So that's the concept behind it. And, I do want to spend more time on the mechanism because people are always, asking about that. But I do want to show some data because now there's the neural substrate, there's the functional effects, but also then, can we actually drive behavioral changes related to tinnitus perception? And so the approach that has been going on with the company involved with neuromodulation devices is using tongue stimulation, electrical stimulation of the tongue with headphones to present the sounds. And I'm not going to go into the details of the study. It's all available publicly. So if you're interested, here is the reference to read in more detail. And of course, I have to give credit to these individuals here. They were the key people driving this study, both at the Dublin, Ireland site and the Regensburg, Germany site. So you could see here all the great individuals who pushed this research forward. So the design, just briefly, is we present the treatment for 12 weeks. And there's 3 different treatment protocols, which I'll get to in the next slide. And that treatment's presented for 12 weeks. And then the treatment is turned off. And then for 12 months, the individuals are tracked to see post-treatment effects. And we looked at different measures, key ones being tinnitus handicap inventory and tinnitus functional index were the 2 main ones. And there were different inclusion criteria that you could see here, the key ones, but there's a longer list in the paper. So what stimuli did we use? And going back to the concept, how this is all working, the important thing would be that, ideally, if we knew what the tinnitus percept or neurons were, then you'd want to do everything but that sound. It's more challenging to do that. And there's some ideas of research that I'm personally interested in to figure that out. But without that, the next best thing is to just try lots of different sounds and have a diverse range of sounds. And so what you see here for arm 1 is that there was a wide range, 500 to 8,000 hertz, many different frequencies. But the key thing here is that the stimuli, the tones presented to the ears are paired with tongue stimulation, similar to what you saw in those animal studies, pairing them. And there was a mapping, a pairing of the tone that you present to the location on the tongue. So that was our synchronized approach. Arm 2, we added some delays. It's very similar to arm 1, but adding some delays and kind of shifting of the map on the tongue. And arm 3, we added longer delays and changed the frequency range, but still a diverse range of frequencies were presented. So all 3 of this is what we presented in the 3 different arms. Now, I will say we didn't see a significant difference, a pre-specified significant difference between the arms. And we did see some trends, some separation on the long term, which I'll present a slide. But I decided just due to time to pull all the data together and give you the summary data. And so what you see here is THI on the x-axis at baseline before treatment happened. And then on the y-axis is what happened after 12 weeks of treatment. And of course, the diagonal line means that there's no change. And then if you're below the line, that means you had an improvement. And so out of the 326 individuals that we had for the trial, we were able to get data back, 260 individuals. And you could see here that 86.1% fell below that line, but many individuals had changes that were greater than 7, 10 points, even some that were having 30, 40, 50 point changes. So you could see here that at 12 weeks of treatment, what the distribution is of improvements. Now, what was impressive for me was that after 12 months post-treatment, of the ones that we could further track, 151 individuals, you could see that many of them still had prolonged treatment effects, therapeutic effects, even out 12 months after the treatment ended. And looking at a little bit easier to see the data over time. Now, this is just individuals that came to every single visit, so we could track them over time. You see that there was this quick acting effect within 6 weeks of treatment. So you see that negative means improvement in tinnitus, and it dropped down to about 14 points improvement in THI, for example, here. And then interesting, there was a plateau effect, which we're addressing in a follow-up study, 10A2. But you could see then that there was this plateau effect where arm one appeared to be more sustained than the other arms. Of course, it's post hoc analysis that we analyze, so just be cautious there. But there is some trends showing that potentially arm one or the synchronized stim may at least drive more plateau effects, sustained effects than this longer delay, lower frequencies treatment approach. And just some more tangible outcomes. Compliance rates, we saw that 84% of individuals were able to use the device. The minimum compliance was 36 hours. And arm one, arm three, two, and three, you could see, comparable overall, about 84%, out of 326. So we were happy to see that. To me, THI, TFI, they're obviously solid, strong measures. But when you want to, okay, thank you, Anusha. So if you want to look at more, I guess, real world effects, the satisfaction rates is important to just ask the individuals, would you say you benefited from using the device? And here you see that 66.5% out of 272 individuals that we were able to track said yes. And this was interesting to me because someone with tinnitus, would you recommend they try this treatment? And it was 78%. So it was higher than those who actually benefited. So even though some didn't benefit, they were still felt that it was, reasonably easy to use or comfortable to use, that they would recommend it to others. So finally, just, I have one more slide. It's always interesting because you do clinical trials. It's a very systematic way of doing it, and you have certain inclusion-exclusion criteria. The question is, what happens to the data when it, the treatment when it goes to the clinics in real world, because it's much more heterogeneous and more complex in how it's being implemented, or could vary in how it's being implemented. And so one of the first clinics in Europe to commercialize the treatment was at Hanover Medical School, led by Professor Thomas Lennartz and Andreas Buchner, also Dr. Lesinski-Shidat. And they were able to publish their first 20 patients that they had come through their clinic. And it's already published if you're interested in Brain Stimulation Journal. Now they were looking at the data at the first 6 to 12 weeks of treatment. And just to give you a sense how it happened, they basically had their visit one consultation. Then they were able to get at their second visit, the THI at both of these visits, and then of course fitting on visit two. From there, then individuals took the device home with bimodal stimulation and came back between 6 to 12 weeks. Now, when you look at the scores that they obtained, improvements in THI for the specific stimulation strategy that is comparable to the first arm one strategy in 10A1, you see that they obtained about 10.4 points improvement, and then the study was 14.6. So it wasn't as much as the 10A1, but it was still encouraging. It was consistent, comparable. What I found more encouraging was that if you look at the individual patients that came through the clinic, you see on the x-axis negative means improvement, and each of these green bars is a different patient. You could see when you compare it to the 10A1 study, the distribution looks quite similar, and the amount of changes are comparable. And so this was encouraging that even in the real world, when things get more complex, you still can have things in line with what we saw with 10A1 study. So this is our first direction of encouraging results that are happening in the real world. And obviously we're going to be collecting more of that and see how things move along. So just to summarize, overall, I hope I apologize. The key title of Pavlov, and my slide was missing there, surprisingly. I don't know where that went, but the key thing is that, Pavlov doing paired stimulation over a century ago, showing that you can make the brain more sensitive to sounds, and then the 40 years of research showing that there's a neural substrate and paired neural stimulation that you can cause these changes in the brain. All of this leading to that bimodal stimulation. It feels like, I believe there's promise there in causing real changes in the brain. And it appears from our data that you could treat symptoms of tinnitus with it. in clinical studies and in real world conditions. The other thing is that, not surprising if you believe in the proposed mechanism, is that a range of body and sound stimulation patterns can be effective in driving these changes in the brain and for symptoms, treating symptoms of tinnitus. And overall, we had a strong safety profile with the device, no serious adverse treatment-related serious adverse events, and having high satisfaction rates. So with that, thank you so much.